All right. Hi, and welcome to Red Reviews, number 20, with Justin Clark. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you, Cory. This is really exciting to have done 20, and I think we mentioned, when we did the 10th one, it's like, it'll be great when we get to the 20th one, and,
Yeah.
and then we'll get to the 30th, 40th, whatever. I think we'll do like a special 100th episode or whatever, and maybe we'll wear like fun outfits or something. I don't know.
That sounds great to me. Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's been a very busy, time, for me, work-wise and other things. But I know before we get started, I just wanted to say, I'm really thrilled with how the recent live stream we did turned out. I think it was an excellent live stream that people should check out.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun. We had YouTuber Anarch on, and some random geek, and a local member of the Democratic Socialists for Canada, and Ben Burgess, who is a rising star in left media.
Yeah. Yeah. He's if there's an A-list, he's kind of there, right?
Right.
Well, and he had just done Rogan. So it was like, wow, whatever. But yeah, no, Ben's a good dude. And I'm looking forward to the possibility of, he emailed me after our chat and he was like, hey, you want to do something? I was like, yeah, sure. So we're going to be working something out to maybe do an episode or something, but I don't know when that'll happen. But yeah, I think that would be very exciting. But yeah, no, it's been really fun doing all the different things that we've been doing, and between this and my job and party work, with the PSL, I've been so busy. But it's just so nice tonight to kind of get back to basics and to do another do another episode of Red Reviews. So
for sure.
This one is a book I've wanted to read for a very, very long time. Someone who I greatly admire, and this book did not disappoint. It's absolutely incredible. It is Women, Race, and Class by Angela Davis. Her classic work on the history of the United States and its women's movement and its relationship to class and its relationship to race. It's right in the title. And the thing that I was not expecting was how incredibly adept she is as an historian. I expected the book to be more like theory heavy than it was. It was actually more history.
Okay.
And which I really appreciated. There was definitely some theory in there, especially in the last couple of chapters. But I really loved most of the book for its historical content. She does an excellent job of being able to synthesize a lot of really good historical research by some excellent historians, people like Philip Foner and Herbert Aptheker and others alongside primary sources. So that has just been, it was a joy to read.
That's awesome.
So, if there was a through line through this book, because this book is more in many ways like a collection of essays that are kind of tied together. But if we were to tie the book together, alongside just the title, is that there really is kind of like two forms of feminism, right? And we often talk about first wave, second wave, third wave, and I'm not so much interested in that. What I'm more interested in is sort of, pegging down what I think is really the crucial divide and what I think Davis thinks is the crucial divide, which is the difference between bourgeois feminists and proletarian feminists, and how the struggle for women's emancipation in the United States and globally really hinges on this divide, and how that divide and all the contradictions that go with it often lead to the sort of, two steps forward, one step back that we've seen in terms of progress for women.
Right.
And, so she opens the book. Her first chapter is about life for, Black women during slavery. And she talks about how the gender roles for enslaved people were very different than the gender roles for the enslavers or for the white sort of bourgeois or genteel class. And what she argues for and sort of is saying that within enslaved people's communities, there was a certain amount of egalitarianism among men and women that did not exist in the white enslaver communities. So when she talks about that, mostly she's talking about the ways in which the sort of gender delineations are less clear with enslaved peoples, precisely because of the demand for their labor, right? So there was no like distinction where like, the enslaved women only worked in this and enslaved men only worked in that. And that's not really true. Okay. Enslaved women did work in the fields as much as they maybe worked in the homes. And so, it kind of leads us to thinking about, the fact that the work that enslaved black women were required to do, were compelled to do, forced to do under the slavery system, sort of provided them this weird, but I think ample opportunity to develop themselves in a way that white women could not develop themselves within the system. Like I'm not saying like slavery is good. What I'm saying is that because the gender differences were flattened in the system of slavery, it sort of killed some of it rooted out some of the distinctions that would have happened within white culture, especially in mid to late, into 19th century culture, where the development of the housewife or the development of like the woman as gentle, a submissive person is something that really comes to the fore in like Britain and in America. Let me see if I can. So she talks about how but that's not to say that they didn't face real challenges, right? So one of the ways that they were severely challenged was not just the physical abuse that they experienced, but the sexual abuse that they experienced. Right. And the ways in which, sexual abuse or those kinds of things, were used not just as a way to keep the sort of enslaved population in line in terms of understanding the power dynamic between the enslaved and the enslavers, but also it kept in line the way that enslaved women were perceived. So this is where you get the trope of the black woman as promiscuous or the black man as promiscuous. These come from these tropes because this is the sort of ideological justification that enslavers would give for their heinous acts of sexual violence was, they are promiscuous anyway or whatever. And in many ways, what this did was it sort of negated the enslaved's very humanity. And in doing so, negated not just their humanity, but negated their sense of womanhood, because their womanhood was sort of ripped from them by these systems of coercion. And so I'm trying to find a passage, as she says here, she's like, required by the master's demands to be as masculine in the performance of their work as their men, black women must have been profoundly affected by their experiences during slavery. Some, no doubt, were broken and destroyed, yet the majority survived and in the process acquired qualities considered taboo by the 19th century ideology of womanhood. And so, they had a certain level of like independence and a certain level of like separateness, and that they would have that white women would not really like consider a thing that they would sort of fight for until you get like decades later, right? Right. But that's not to say that there weren't some white women who were clearly like on the sort of at the vanguard of this movement starting in like the 18th century. But yeah, so that's kind of the first chapter. I thought it was really interesting because like she does an excellent job of, again, synthesizing a lot of really good historical work that has been done by previous historians alongside her own use of primary sources, enslaved people's accounts and accounts of the enslavers and the kind of the way that they viewed men and women. Because there's this kind of like, I think there's like this like cliche within, like popular culture, when we talk about slavery, that like, slave women only kind of really worked in the houses and the men worked on the fields. And like, that's not really true.
That's
like
the pop culture version of things.
Right. Whereas, black women worked just as hard as men on the fields. And sometimes they even did it when they were pregnant. Because, the sort of, the notion that, they're with child, therefore we shouldn't have them be working as hard. That didn't really matter to them, right? Right. Because the
slaveholders didn't give a shit, right?
the enslavers didn't care.
Yeah.
And so their whole thing was, well, I just see them as nothing more than quote unquote breeders. That like, if they die, who gives a fuck? Like, as long as the child they're carrying is healthy, I don't give a shit.
Right.
And so,
literally livestock is what.
Literally livestock. They were treated very much as livestock, and so that kind of really peppers how the women's rights movement kind of grows in America. Is that there's always this intersection between, in her title, women, race, and class, and how those things interact with one another, and how the women's movement is always hampered by notions of class and notions of race. And the one thing that I learned from the book that's also interesting for me in later chapters is the extent to which the anti-slavery movement was a huge component to the women's rights movement, especially pre-Civil War era. So you have the development of women's rights societies, and you have activists like the Grimke sisters, Sarah and Angelina Grimke. You have people like early on, like in the 18th century, somebody like Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley writing, Vindication of the Rights of Women. And then you have other early women's rights pioneers like Lucretia Mott and so on and so forth. And that the through line through all of them was not only were they fighting for the emancipation of women, they were fighting for the emancipation of the enslaved. That there was a strong connection between the abolitionist movement as it was developing and the women's rights movement as it was developing. So that's on one side. And then the other coin of that is the impact and influence of Frederick Douglass, who we've covered in a previous episode when we did his book, Narrative of the Life. Douglass, of course, was one of the very early women's rights supporters and understood the struggle that went together, right? And so as an abolitionist, his idea was to combine the movements and to acknowledge how important the emancipation of women was to the emancipation of the slaves, because they went hand in hand. She also talks about, obviously, like, if you think of a book like Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe, the classic, American novel that sort of was one of the big sort of cultural touchstones that sort of maybe tipped off the Civil War. Well, one of the things about that book that's interesting is that it is imbued with the same kind of gender and class politics of a lot of the sort of middle class white women of the time, right?
Right.
And so it kind of paints the sort of the black characters, the enslaved characters in the novels, as these sort of like archetypes of like, obedient or submissive, black people who, are like deeply, deeply moral, but then like also deeply subjugated by white people. and so it has all of the problems with it that any novel written by a sort of middle class white woman in the 19th century would have.
Right. Yeah. That makes sense.
So the other kind of big revelation that's important that came from the book is the extent to which the women's rights movement in America was deeply racist. Which is something that a lot of people don't pick up on, because the way that we often lionize the kind of heroes, especially of like the women's suffrage movement, so people like Elizabeth Cady Stanton or Susan B. Anthony, that these women were racists, and that they explicitly isolated black women from their movement in an attempt to placate the white Southern sort of middle class women who were a part of the women's suffrage movement.
Right.
And one of the arguments that the women's suffrage movement used was that it's important for us as white women to get the vote before black men. So if you think about during the 1860s, you have post-Civil War, you have what are called the Civil War Amendments. 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments.
Right.
13th Amendment abolishes slavery, although put a huge fucking asterisk next to that because it doesn't count prison labor, right?
Right.
We can, and that is, a book that goes into that in more detail is a classic book by Michelle Alexander called The New Jim Crow, if you want to learn more about that. And the documentary 13th, which I think is on Netflix, the Ava DuVernay film. Excellent documentary, goes into that, the complications of the 13th Amendment. You have the 14th Amendment, which is I think it's the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment. I think the 14th one is basically like naturalization, and then the 15th Amendment is the suffrage amendment for black men.
Okay.
So everybody knew that with the 15th Amendment, like the extension of suffrage was a huge battle. And you had divides within the women's rights movement, the women's suffrage movement, about how to go forward. So there were those like Frederick Douglass who believed that the passage of the 15th Amendment was essential. And the reason he believed that was because that would be the stepping stone to getting to the women's right to vote. Because if we can get this, we can get that. And we can make an argument that if we extend suffrage to these people, we should extend suffrage to these people, these other people. Mm-hmm. That was the sort of, but that argument ultimately gets shut down. And the argument that ultimately wins is the one that's backed by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony and other high leaders within the women's suffrage movement. Many of whom, of course, remember, they're white, they're middle class. These are women who come from either like super established wealth, like in the case of Elizabeth Cady Stanton, or they come from like, you know, like solid middle class backgrounds. These people are these women, they're like society women. The suffrage movement is made up of society women who, because they didn't have to work, they needed something to do. And this was their thing to do. And again, I think that's a noble thing. I don't want to discount that, but I'm just saying like that's the class dynamic, right? Yeah. Because not only were black women largely excluded from the women's suffrage movement early on, but working class women were largely isolated from the women's suffrage movement early on, especially like, you know, like women, especially like immigrants, women immigrants who maybe worked in the textile mills in Lowell, Massachusetts, or and so on and so forth, you know.
For sure.
So working women were often excluded from this movement too. And there was always this kind of implicit notion that with women's suffrage that it would really only be for the white moneyed classes of women would be able to vote. Not black women, not working women, so on. Now, here's where it gets really screwy, right? The story that I think is really fascinating is the one that goes into the fact that there was a congressman who was a virulent racist who basically saw the women's rights movement. He was a Democrat back when Democrats were like, you know, well, you can make the argument about this today, but like back when Democrats were like, you know, KKK and virulently racist and Southerners and whatever.
Right.
But there was a congressman.
They switched sides.
Right. But there was a congressman, and I think his name was James Brooks. But there was this congressman who essentially like used women's suffrage as a wedge issue to stop the 15th Amendment, to sort of stop black male suffrage, because he sort of saw like, why on earth would we give the black man the vote before white women? Like, it's absurd. And the argument that, of course, they go upon like, you know, the sort of typical racist tropes of like that they're uneducated, they're unpropertied, so on and so forth.
From my perspective in 2022, this just looks like misogyny versus racism. Who wins? Like nobody. Like
Exactly right. And so the thing that's like so important for this whole moment is that this congressman, this like racist, white supremacist congressman, ends up actually kind of bankrolling parts of the women's suffrage movement.
Interesting.
And goes on a national speaking tour with Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. And he helped set up a newspaper for them, basically articulating their pro-white women's suffrage, white supremacist views. And so like, yeah,
white supremacy, I guess, is the one that they think is more important, right?
Exactly. And Susan B. Anthony pretty much saw themselves as sort of trying to sort of purge the women's suffrage movement of unsavory elements that would alienate them from the South. So they wanted these sort of white Southern women as a part of the movement. And the way to do that was to basically say, Black women, you can't be a part of this. And working class women, you can't be a part of this.
Right.
There's a quote. Yeah, I believe this quote is on the start of chapter 4. It's Racism in the Women's Suffrage Movement, the chapter 4. This is a long extended quote from Elizabeth Cady Stanton, but I'm only going to read the last part of it. Okay. And it's her talking about the 15th Amendment. She also uses racial slurs and stereotypes to describe Black men. So not great. Ones I'm not going to say. So she says, quote unquote, this is the Negro's hour. Are we sure that he, once entrenched in all his inalienable rights, may not be an added power to hold us at bay? Have not Black male citizens been heard to say they doubted the wisdom of extending the right of suffrage to women? Why should the African prove more just and generous than his Saxon compeers? If the 2 millions of Southern Black women are not to be secured their rights of person, property, wages, and children, their emancipation is but another form of slavery. In fact, it is better to be the slave of an educated white man than a degraded, ignorant Black one. And so that's from Elizabeth Cady Stanton. So again, I think what's really important here, and this is from her History of Women's Suffrage book that she wrote with Susan B. Anthony and Matilda Jocelyn Gage. But this led to real divisions within the women's suffrage movement, where, organizations decided to break off. Black women set up their own organizations, to fight for women's suffrage because they were so alienated from the broader women's suffrage movement or the white women's suffrage movement. Stanton's indignation, this is from historian Eleanor Flexter, Stanton's indignation and that of Susan B. Anthony, knew no bounds. The latter, meaning Susan B. Anthony, made the pledge that I will cut this right arm of mine before I will ever work for or demand the ballot for the Negro and not the woman. Mrs. Stanton made derogatory references to a racial slur and the enfranchisement of Africans, Chinese, and all the ignorant, quote unquote, foreigners that foment the moment they touch our shores. She warned that the Republicans' advocacy of manhood suffrage creates an antagonism between Black men and all women that will culminate in fearful outrages on womanhood, especially in the southern states. The especially in the southern states part is super important. Mm-hmm. So, again, it's just so important to understand that Susan B. Anthony is on currency in the United States. She's on her own dollar, right? Susan B. Anthony is on money. And Elizabeth Cady Stanton is held up by freethinkers in the atheist movement as being this champion of liberal reform, and Stanton herself was alienated from the women's suffrage movement for writing books that were critical of Christianity and so on. So she's kind of held up as this leader. But it turns out that both of them were hardcore racists who believed in the sort of higher and lower civilization bullshit. So and so ultimately what happens is that the women's suffrage movement happens, but it happens really without the support, or it happens obviously Black women and working class women of all races and backgrounds, they all fight for women's suffrage. But they're never written in the history books. Their story often gets left out. And so what Davis is doing in this book is sort of reasserting their relevance to this movement, whether it's the African American Women's Clubs movement, which she devotes a chapter to, and its support of not just suffrage, but to fight against lynching, which became a huge problem post-Civil War, where thousands of Black people were killed by racist mobs, both men and women. There's a horrific story of, I think this happened in Texas, where there was a lynching where they beat this person to death, shoved them in a barrel filled with nails, and rolled them down a hill. I mean, just brutal, brutal shit, right? And the sort of national conscience on the issue of lynching was a woman named Ida B. Wells Barnett. And Ida B. Wells was a Black woman who had really incredible militant journalism. She wrote numerous books on the issue of lynching. And again, the women's movement sort of tries to sort of downplay the issues of lynching in service of women's suffrage rather than fighting for making the world a little bit of a better place. And and to this day, the United States does not have a federal anti-lynching law. There was debate and discussion of the passage of a federal anti-lynching law a couple of years ago with the horrific murder of Ahmaud Arbery. But that was killed in the Senate, mostly by Kentucky Senator Rand Paul. So the South strikes again in terms of, holding this country back from any sort of justice or any sort of progress. Yeah. And not like the Southern people, but the Southern politicians and their bourgeois supporters. Yeah. So let me see what else I want to mention here. The meaning of it. So I think the other thing too is the importance of education. So she has a chapter devoted to education and liberation. She talks about how there were, school teachers as early as the early 1800s who would set up these schools that were open to both black and white students, and that they were kind of shut down by local authorities. Of course, this happens in New England. I think this is in Massachusetts or whatever. But how education became such a crucial component to the struggle and how during, Reconstruction, for those who don't know, so the period of 1865 to about 1877 in this country, in the United States, is called Reconstruction. It's this period of time where the federal government uses its extensive resources, both militarily and financially and politically, to essentially reset the slate. So this is where you get the establishment of what are called freedmen's bureaus, which are these agencies that were developed to set up some forms of equity, whether it be in education, housing, or employment, so on and so forth. Yeah. And during Reconstruction, education became a crucial component, where you had the freedmen's schools, and a lot of times these were the first public schools in America. That were free for people to go to, and for both black and white students. So imagine, in the 1860s and 70s, there were desegregated, grade schools in the United States. And they're all ended by they call it Hayes's betrayal. Rutherford B. Hayes, who became president in 1877, his election was extremely contentious. He actually didn't win the popular vote, but he won the electoral vote. Against the Democrat. It was a guy named Samuel Tilden. And basically it broke down to a close political ally of his sort of wanted to be a high up in his cabinet. So they made sort of a deal. And so everybody sort of thought of it as being a deal. Okay. Very much akin to how John Quincy Adams became president and Henry Clay wanted to be Secretary of State. It's kind of the same thing. Right. And so Hayes becomes president. And the big reason he wins the electoral vote is he says, I will end Reconstruction and I will let the South do what it wants to do. And so when Reconstruction ends, you have the reassertion of Southern dominance over black people in this country, in the United States. First with what are called the Black Codes, and which eventually get formalized in what we today call Jim Crow. Mm-hmm. And so there were many organizations who were fighting against this, and the education of people, especially of black people in this country, not only by them, not only education for themselves, but the ways in which others try to help them, I think was, it was a huge critical moment. But yeah, so she has a really fun chapter that's interesting called Communist Women, where she tells the history of these very influential female communists. So she talks about, somebody like Lucy Parsons, who, she was, very influential in the sort of Haymarket riots that happened, and she was involved with the Labor Party. And all these people sort of went from being liberals to anarchists to communists. They moved across the map. So, you have that. You have Mother Bloor, who is sort of like a Mother Jones type, who she hitchhiked across the country to different strikes and fought for the labor movement. You have Anita Whitney, who she ran. I think she was a part of the California Communist Party, and she ran the California Communist Party. You have Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, who a lot of anarchists kind of celebrate, and kind of a big figure. She was a big part of the socialist and communist movement for over 60 years. She was a part of the IWW with Big Bill Haywood, the Industrial Workers of the World. She agitated for labor rights among Native American leaders. And then, of course, she joins the Communist Party in the 1930s. And then the last one she talks about is Claudia Jones, who was a very influential African-American female communist leader in the United States. I'll read you a section in this chapter that she says about Claudia Jones. Davis writes, Claudia Jones was very much a communist, a dedicated communist who believed that socialism held the only promise of liberation for black women, for black people as a whole, and indeed for the multiracial working class. Thus, her criticism was motivated by the constructed desire to see her white co-workers and comrades to purge themselves of racist and sexist attitudes. So it's this universal project, right? They sort of saw the anti-racist work they were doing as part and parcel with their work they were doing to create socialism.
It's such a distinct difference between like black emancipation groups or native indigenous or indigenous emancipation groups. Like these like non-white groups always are more universal than white groups. Yes. Like right. It's always the white people that are like, nah, just us we get to be good.
Right. And we even see this, unfortunately, within some sectors of what passes at the left. Yeah. And you're totally right. And I think this gets to, what I talked about in the live stream, but so the idea of from the late great Michael Brooks, who said the idea of a cosmopolitan socialism. Mm-hmm. And what he meant by that was this sort of broad universal project that was people learned from one another. There was a universalism to it. And that human universals are applicable, they are realizable. We talked a little bit about that with Sartre last time.
Yeah.
And so, the communist movement was always at the forefront of anti-racist politics. So for example, like in the 1930s when, Earl Browder was running under the Communist Party ticket in 1936 with John W. Ford. John W. Ford was a black man from Alabama who was a labor organizer. Basically like rose from nothing. His, parents were slaves and was able to become the first, African-American on a major party ticket for vice president in American history, decades before Davis herself would do it. Because Angela Davis ran for vice president, I think in 1980 on the American Communist Party ticket with Gus Hall. Which is why it was always striking to me when people always talked about like the importance of Kamala Harris. And I'm like, yeah, I guess. But like, if you really want to talk about like who was really a trailblazer in that, it was Angela Davis. And it was 4 decades before with the American Communist Party. But apparently they don't count the American Communist Party as a major party. Although at one time it almost had 1 million members, but whatever. So there's that. And then the last 3 chapters of the book are kind of the most theoretical.
Okay.
But of course they have incredible, historical material in them as well. The chapter 11, and for those who are still listening, if you're listening to the live stream or you're listening to the recording, I just want to enter a content note right now that we are going to be discussing rape. Or do I need to say like the R word, Cory, or what's the procedure for this in terms of the live stream?
I think that, that's probably good. Like,
okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So the chapter 11 in the book deals with the myth of what is called the quote unquote the myth of the black rapist. So there's this idea in popular culture and historical research, and even in some well-respected research on rape by scholars such as Susan Brown Miller, of the myth of this black rapist. This idea of the black man as this insatiable sexual desire, and he's defiling white women, and that this was a justification for lynching, which often happened. And so, what Davis does in this chapter, she sort of breaks down bit by bit why this is wrong, and about how, in fact, if anything, it was the other way around, where you had huge amounts of white men actually raping black women, not just in slavery, but after it, as a means of not just sort of sexual gratification, but also as a means of power.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so, it's pretty harrowing stuff, but she really does go into, I think, really just breaking down these myths, and even myths written by, people who, like she kind of talks about Susan Brown Miller's book on her scholarship on rape, which is kind of like Susan Brown Miller wrote one of like the first big historical sociological studies on rape in the 1970s.
Oh, okay.
But there are parts of what she says where she sort of says, like, Susan Brown Miller's discussion on rape and race evinces an unthinking partisanship which borders on racism. In pretending to defend the cause of all women, she sometimes boxes herself into the position of defending the particular cause of white women, regardless of its implications. And so, and then this kind of gets into what I was saying earlier. Davis writes, although white men who are employers, executives, politicians, doctors, professors, etc., have been known to quote unquote take advantage of women they consider their social inferiors, their sexual misdeeds seldom come to light in court. It is not therefore quite probable that these men of the capitalist and middle classes account for a significant proportion of the unreported rapes. So like I think this gets to the heart of how this myth of the black rapist is this idea to sort of justify not just violence against black men, but also violence against black women. Because one of the arguments he talks about is how, because of the sort of presumed or the sort of perceived quote unquote promiscuity of black men, that it sort of bleeds into thinking that there's a promiscuity among black women, and that black women are also sort of sexually unhinged and so on and so forth. And so when a white man rapes a black woman, oh, well, it's not that big a deal because she, probably quote unquote wanted it anyway. Like it's this kind of horrible, disgusting stuff. But I think it's important because I think it lays out how these tropes have in these myths, some that are even upheld by quote unquote liberals or people who consider themselves progressives, do unmitigated damage to and violence to black men and to black women in the form of lynching, in the form of rapes, and in the form of other forms of sexual or just physical violence. So I think that chapter it's pretty harrowing stuff, but I think it's very important because these myths are so pervasive, and sometimes we don't even thinking about them, right? Like, and so it's like you have to catch yourself and go like, wait a minute, am I falling for the same kind of racist tropes that justified lynching? Right. And or justified the rape of black women? Like, you have to think about those things. So that's really, really important. The second to last chapter. Yeah, go ahead.
Not to make excuses for them, because it's been proven in court and it's been proven that they are victimizers. Like Bill Cosby or what was the singer R. Kelly. Like,
right.
There's a reason that we saw those and there were huge publicity around them versus say the public, like, I can't even think of an example of a white rapist like that had that much publicity around them but there's almost certainly exist, right? Like the big names. So
exactly. And the few that do come to mind are often ones because they are so atrocious. I mean, we often think of allegedly somebody like Jeffrey Epstein, right?
Right.
But the point that you just made is so crucial that in fact Frederick Douglass also made the same point back in 1894, and Davis quotes him in the book. He says, quote unquote, I do not pretend that Negroes are saints and angels. I do not deny that they are capable of committing the crime imputed to them, but utterly deny that they are any more addicted to the commission of that crime than is true of any other variety of the human family. I am not a defender of any man guilty of this atrocious crime, but I am a defender of the colored people as a class. So like that's getting back to what he's saying here, which is that again, people do bad things. There are cases in history where, a black man may have raped a white woman, and that's totally inexcusable. But what's important here is that those cases aren't any more pervasive than, say, a white man raping a black woman or a white man raping a white woman, right? Like these happen because of, the sort of structure of society, and then, some forms of, I don't want to get too much into like the human nature argument thing, but like, but yeah, like this idea, but it's so important for us to distinguish that like that humans are capable of these heinous crimes, and it's regardless of race, but to single people out because of their race for these particular crimes is inexcusable.
Yeah.
And indefensible.
And to imagine that, like you say, like to imagine that it is more prevalent for black men to commit this crime than white men, that's just racist, right? Like,
yes, it's racist, and it's not backed up by any empirical evidence. It's just not true.
Yeah.
But it's a myth that has been continually carried out to not just maintain white supremacy, but to maintain some kind of patriarchy as well.
Right.
It's a way to maintain the sort of white cis hetero dominance within, capitalist societies. And
I mean, not to get too far afield, but it also upholds like the rape culture and patriarchy, because it keeps the image of the scary black man in the shadows as the rapist, and not the guy who took you on a date, right?
Exactly. Or it reinforces the black woman who is, she's promiscuous anyway. She was quote unquote asking for it. These kinds of awful, disgusting tropes. That are, you're right, they're absolutely in the service of white supremacy, but they're also in the service of patriarchy. Yeah. And it's our goal as sort of radicals, progressive, socialists, whatever, communists, anarchists, to acknowledge that these myths are pervasive and real.
Yeah.
But that the truth is more important than the myth, and to expose the myth for what it is, which is a lie.
Yep.
So the last two chapters are also pretty interesting. Chapter 12 is about women's reproductive rights and the ways in which sort of the white women's rights movement, and made up of mostly white middle-class women, also continues to have racist connotations, specifically in regards to reproductive rights. So she does go into the pretty unsavory history of Margaret Sanger, which is something that like the right wing uses against abortion activists and Planned Parenthood all the time, because she's kind of one of the founders of Planned Parenthood. So early on, Margaret Sanger was a socialist. She identified as a socialist. She also identified as like a free thinker. A lot of free thought groups and atheist groups often hold her up as being kind of a hero for, because she was a secular person or whatever. But I would not do that at all, because this woman was a virulent racist and eugenicist. So there's really Davis breaks down how there's basically like two phases to her career. The first phase is what people love to focus on, which is like her being a socialist, wanting to fight for a more egalitarian world, fighting for reproductive health.
That's where the good stuff came out of.
All the good stuff. And then there's the second phase where she kind of wanted to go big time. She recognized that if she was to stay in the socialist movement exclusively, and fight for a more egalitarian form of like birth control, which is a term I think she came up with, that her opinions or her view of the world, or her advocacy work would be sort of relegated to the margins. And so she wanted to kind of become mainstream. And the way that she became mainstream was becoming a white supremacist and eugenicist. So she started to court the support of virulent eugenicists, and her whole worldview kind of shifted to supporting that kind of, horrible, kind of thing. When Margaret Sanger severed her ties with the Socialist Party for the purpose of building an independent birth control campaign, she and her followers became more susceptible than ever before to the anti-black and anti-immigrant propaganda of the times. And she said, like, by 1919, the eugenic influence on the birth control movement was unmistakably clear. An article that she wrote for the American Birth Control League Journal, she defined the chief issue of birth control as more children from the fit, less from the unfit.
Yikes.
And then she wrote a letter to So not only was it like birth control like an issue, but the issue of sterilization was also important. So this is where you get the emergence of sterilization laws, where people who were deemed unfit by medical professionals within the state mass sterilized people, including people who were mentally or physically disabled, and then obviously just huge amounts of black people. I mean, they just full blown made people sterile just because they were black. So she actually wrote this. She's like, "We do not want to get out," she wrote to a colleague, Margaret Sanger wrote to a colleague. "We do not want to get the word out that we want to exterminate the Negro population, and the minister is the man who can straighten out that idea if it ever occurs in any of the more rebellious members." So like they were trying to leverage their connections to the black clergy to sort of push their birth control agenda. What the real motive was to have black people have less kids. Like that was really the goal, was like, we want less black people because we see them as inferior.
Right.
And we're going to leverage like black ministers to do that by basically lying to them about their true intentions. And this stuff would have very, real world implications. So for example, in 1972, 16,000 women and 8,000 men had been sterilized under the auspices of federal programs. That's just in 1972. So Carl Schultz, director of Housing, Education, Health, Education, and Welfare, which that's what the Department of Education and the Department of Health and Human Services used to be one, and it used to be HEW or HUE.
Okay.
So Carl Schultz, director of HUE's Population Affairs Office, estimated that between 100,000 and 200,000 sterilizations had actually been funded that year by the federal government. That's 1972. During Hitler's Germany, incidentally, 250,000 sterilizations were carried out under Nazis' hereditary health law. Is it possible that the record of the Nazis throughout the years of their reign may have been almost equaled by U.S. government-funded sterilizations in the space of a single year? So this gets to the heart of what's really going on here. And I'm going to end that chapter with talking about a really horrific story of two young black girls who were the Ralph sisters, Minnie Lee and Mary Alice Ralph. Minnie Lee was 12 and Mary Alice was 14, and they were both sterilized without their consent. The government, the local government had taken advantage of the Montgomery Community Action Committee had taken, no, sorry, I said this wrong. So like these birth control, they took advantage of the fact that their mother was illiterate. And so they had taken a sort of a birth prevention measure called Depo-Provera. Well, in tests, this had been caught to cause cancer in test animals. So they wanted to sterilize these girls so that they couldn't pass on whatever they had gotten from this drug to whatever children they may have had. But that was not what they told their mother. What they told their mother was, we're going to do a procedure to protect them from whatever effects from this Depo-Provera was. But what they actually ended up doing was sterilizing these two young girls who hadn't fully even entered puberty yet. So like, so it's pretty disgusting. Like, just in North Carolina alone, under the auspices of the Eugenics Commission of North Carolina, which was an official government office, by the way, 7,686 sterilizations have been carried out since 1933. Although the operations were justified as measures to prevent the reproduction of mentally deficient persons, quote unquote, about 5,000 of the sterilized persons have been black. So well over 50%, close to 2/3 of the sterilizations that had happened in North Carolina since 1933 had been black people.
Because when you're racist, you can just justify to yourself that these are the people that are mentally deficient, I guess.
Exactly, right. And this gets to the heart of the whole book, which is that there are these elements of what we would think of as progressive reform, whether it be the abolitionist movement, the women's rights movement, women's suffrage, the reproductive rights, and so on and so forth. Because Angela Davis makes a point in this chapter of saying that, like, white women don't understand why black women might be reluctant to join the abortion rights movement. Now, this is the 70s. I think it's probably a little bit different today. It's 50 years ago or whatever when Roe was passed, or Roe was the decision of Roe v. Wade. But Black women might be a little apprehensive about being involved in a movement regarding birth control when it's all middle-class white people, because middle-class white women are the ones who sterilize them, forcibly sterilize them. So like, these are the things that I think are very, very important. She sort of advocates for, not only should we have abortion rights, clearly, but we should also end forced sterilizations, because those two issues go hand in hand. And I had never read anybody who kind of articulated those two things together, although once I read that, I was like, this is so obvious that these two things go together.
Right.
But I never read anybody who really put them together before. And so the final chapter is one that I remember talking about with somebody in a book group when we were discussing Marx's Capital, and she had brought this up because she was reading the book. The last one is about sort of the growing obsolescence of housework, and about how there was a movement growing in the 1970s for women to be paid for housework. Okay. And Angela Davis makes the argument that that's a bad idea for a number of reasons. One, exploitation.
Housework isn't women's work.
First off, housework isn't women's work, for one, right? And in fact, she talks about how during the colonial era in America, the housework was pretty intense, quite a bit of drudgery, because women had to, they had to make the food, they had to make the clothes, they had to make the soap, they had to do everything, right? They had to do the cleaning, they had to do the cooking. And she also talked about an indigenous community who also, the women not only did all that, but they also made the houses. So they built the houses. And so, the reason that she argues that, hey, maybe we shouldn't just pay people to do housework is that it's kind of a Band-Aid on a hemorrhage, because it doesn't really get to the root of the problem, which is exploitation. Yeah. Women, it's considered women's work. It's considered inferior work, despite the fact that, men and women can both perform this work. And if you were to try to, and the thing is that she kind of said, clearly the women who are interested in sort of being paid for housework have never met domestic workers, because domestic workers will be harmed by this, because these people do make a living from cleaning homes. Right. And that if you guarantee some kind of wage to housework, that kind of sort of drops the bottom out from the women who are women or men who are employed by that. So she kind of talks about how, because she talks about how this solution is not enough. Essentially what she argues for is that we don't need to just give women a wage for doing housework. What we need to do is establish socialism. So her whole thing is what she says in the end of the book, she says, what is needed, of course, are new social institutions to assume a good portion of the housewife's old duties. This is a challenge emanating from the swelling ranks of women in the working class. The demand for universal and subsidized childcare is a direct consequence of the rising number of working mothers. The only significant steps towards ending domestic slavery have in fact been taken in the existing socialist countries. Working women, therefore, have a special and vital interest in the struggle for socialism. So this goes back to, writing of Marx and Engels, right? So, Engels wrote a really famous book called The Origin of the Family, Private Property, and the State, where he talks about how before the advent of private property, communal societies were largely far more egalitarian than the systems we live under today, where in some you even had matriarchal societies where women were the primary decision makers, and then you had a certain balance between men and women that does not exist today. And the reason it exists today is because of the development of the surplus, and that the development of the surplus led to the matriarchal system, that men were the ones who got to control the surplus. And then that, of course, develops into feudalism and then into capitalism. Mm-hmm. So clearly, the quote unquote traditional gender roles that people think of, in terms of the housewife, the American housewife, was largely a product of something that happened about 120 years ago. It's not something that's been around forever.
It's not humanity
right. But this idea that there's a men's sphere and there's a woman's sphere, that's an extremely modern phenomenon in the span of human history, which is funny because people call it traditional gender roles. And they're not actually that traditional, to be honest. Right. They're just not. So what she argues for is like, yeah, we could pay people a wage, but that doesn't help the problem of exploitation. That doesn't help the problem of alienation, that women will still feel unhappy in these positions. Like, even if you pay them, they're still going to be fucking depressed because instead of living and fulfilling their own desires and joys and what they want to do with their lives for real, they have to fucking clean and shit,
they're
right?
Forced into this other role.
They're forced into this other role, right? And so like, they're not living up to their full potential either. Or what they want to do with their lives.
Yeah.
And it also reinforces the patriarchy, right? Because if you just pay women for housework, then people will just assume, as you said earlier, it's women's work, right? And that men go off and it justifies a lower wage for domestic work.
Yep.
Because the women who are going to get paid a wage to do housework are obviously going to get paid less because they're not the primary breadwinner.
Yeah.
Right?
And the men are going to go out and make the real money.
The men are going to go out and make the quote-unquote real money, right? So not only is this bad for housewives, but it's also bad, like I said earlier, for domestic workers because it's going to push their wages down too. Yeah. Because now you're going to have a huge glut of people in the labor force. The other thing too is that, as Davis argues, like in the classical, like Marxist sense, or like in the traditional way in which capitalism has been developed, there's been a very clear delineation between like work that is done for a wage and work that is done in the process of social reproduction, which is what housework is considered.
Right.
And so do we really want to monetize that? Because if we do, it opens it up to the same levels, like I said, of exploitation and alienation that would happen under wage work.
Though I'm not surprised that capitalist society would want to monetize that.
Right. Exactly. Right. And here's the thing, right? If you think, because the wages for housework movement was started in Italy in the early 1970s. Again, probably with very, very good intentions. It's very similar to the UBI movement, right?
Right.
Like, UBI is a great idea. Like, don't get me wrong. I think UBI is awesome. The problem is that the way that people want to implement UBI is terrible. Because if we implemented UBI, or universal basic income, the way that Andrew Yang wants to do it,
it's not going to be universal.
And then it's not going to be really particularly universal. Not to mention the fact that like his proposal, which again, like this, like again, if a capitalist government was going to institute like wages for housework, the way they would do it is through sales taxes.
Yeah.
Which means that sales taxes would go through the roof, because that's how Andrew Yang wants to pay for his UBI, was he wanted to do it through sales taxes, which is an extremely regressive tax, which affects more of the poor, because this is going to sound crazy and like kind of counterintuitive, but it's true. Poor people spend more of their money than rich people do.
Yep.
And so poor people pay more like sales tax generally as a whole than rich people do.
Well, because the things that rich people buy aren't usually applicable for sales taxes. The same, like that.
Right. So for example, like rich people, you know why rich people buy a lot of art? The reason they buy a lot of art, it's a money laundering scheme, because that money would be taxed otherwise. If you buy art, it's not.
Yeah.
And so if you buy art as a commodity, because this is what rich people do, they'll just buy a whole bunch of shit and then they'll just box it up and put it in a storage area somewhere.
It's the same reason they invest in the stock market, because then they don't have to pay taxes on the capital gains.
Exactly, right? Exactly. They don't have to pay capital gains taxes. But the thing is like, this is the other problem that Davis doesn't bring up in the book, but I think is an important distinction, is that like the way that these wages would be paid, if they were paid through a government program, they would be paid by sales taxes.
Yeah.
And that would disproportionately harm the poor, because essentially whatever you're paying them is them paying themselves. Like the real way to do a UBI is to take the money from the fucking rich and make them pay their fucking fair share of taxes, and not, like a UBI should not be paid for with sales taxes. A UBI should be paid for with income, or through stocks,
wealth taxes, or
wealth
capital gains taxes.
Capital gains taxes, the increase of the federal income tax. This is how those kinds of things should be paid for, because that's why they're progressive, because sales taxes are regressive. They harm the poor. And again, like Davis gets to, like, it doesn't get to the heart of the issue, which is exploitation. Yeah. Like exploitation is exploitation regardless of whether you call it housework or not. And whether or not you give it a wage doesn't make it any better or worse. It just reinforces the fact that it is exploitation. Yeah. It's not particularly like forward thinking or progressive to say, oh, all this drudgery, well, let's just give you a wage for it. Like, no, actually, let's build a society where people share in the responsibility of all of this, right?
Yeah.
Like where, you know, we do a few hours of like a day job and then we come home and we do a few hours of work of around the house and then we do a few hours of doing whatever we want to do, right? And that men do it and women do it.
That's the thing too, right? Like, because we're devoting so much of our days to working time,
yes,
like then we all almost don't have any time for housework. Like, and that's everybody. Like, I'm not saying men or women. Like, that's everybody.
And think about the fact that in the late 1970s, like the percentage of women in the workforce was like, I think it was like 54% or something like that. Today, it's like 69% of women are in the workforce. I think it's like 72 for men. Right. So 69% of all eligible female workers are working, which means that not only are they holding down a full-time or part-time job, but they're doing all that and they're raising a family, they're doing housework, so on and so forth. Right.
Yeah.
And, you know, and so it is like two jobs. And people say, well, you should be paid for that. And it's like, well, that would be great. But again, it just doesn't get to the heart of the problem, which is that, you know, this stuff is stuff that should be done collectively, socially.
Yeah, that's right.
Because if you pay somebody a wage for this, like, yeah, it might help them. But what would be better for them is some kind of form of universal basic services. I don't like the idea of UBI. I like the idea of UBS. So that includes direct cash payments, but it also includes, universal public health care. It includes universal public preschool and daycare. It includes universal like public goods. So like instead of having to pay out the ass for diapers, you can go in and get them from a commissary and you don't have to pay for them.
Yep.
Like there's something that we offer to each other because the capitalism it has this deep contradiction within it, which is that it's an era of abundance. We have more stuff now than we've ever had. And yet things are scarce. People starve. People don't have clothes. People don't have homes. It's built into the system because you need to force scarcity.
Yep.
Because if you make things abundant, they're no longer profitable. And capitalism collapses on itself. Yeah. This is what Marx and Engels meant when they said, like, capitalism creates its own grave-diggers. It's true. Because all of the systems of production eventually lead themselves to the socialization of everything. That's what we talked about when we talked about Engels' Socialism, Utopian, and Scientific.
Right.
Where he talked about how, once you get to a place of abundance in industrial production, then you can build a society where people's needs are met and you don't have to build things upon the profit motive, you build them upon what people need. And if we really do that, that's truly revolutionary. That's truly building a better system.
Yeah.
So that's what I would argue for is like, why do we need to give them a wage? Why don't we give some kind of universal basic services that everybody can benefit from? And then we'll be much better off.
Yeah, that's right. Well,
so long story short, like Women, Race, and Class, I think is essential reading.
Sounds like it for sure.
And I think that it's incredibly important. For those who don't know, like I should have started the episode talking about who Angela Davis is. But
if you don't know,
who Angela Davis is, like she's very, very, very important. So yeah. Angela Davis is an activist. She's a scholar. She worked, I think, at the University of California, Berkeley for a while before she was fired by Ronald Reagan. She eventually worked, and she taught, she received study in Germany. She was kind of an expert in Goethe, and so she was also a political prisoner. She was accused of assisting someone in a murder that she didn't have anything to do with. And she was in prison for a couple of, years during the trial where, they were trying to make an example of her as a revolutionary leader because she was a part of the U.S. Communist Party. She had been loosely affiliated with the Black Panthers. And so eventually she does win her freedom. She earns her freedom through fighting hard with her lawyers and her legal team and making the argument like clearly she was innocent. And so now, for the last, 40, 50 years, she has been the sort of voice of conscience for the sort of broader socialist left. And she's still around today. And she just re-released a new edition of her autobiography through Haymarket Books, which I've picked up. And it kind of goes into the details of her being a political prisoner.
That's awesome.
And so, yeah, Angela Davis is amazing. And I think that her voice is so unique in that she does like I said, she does a really great job of synthesizing history and theory and activism in a way that's very accessible and very, but also very like erudite and scholarly. So, definitely check out Women, Race, and Class. I think she also has another book that's really, really great. That's put out by Haymarket Books, and it's a collection of her speeches. That's probably where people would mostly know her from, is her various speeches. If you haven't read her yet. Yeah, the collection of speeches that I've read of hers is called Freedom is a Constant Struggle. And she talks about like the Black Lives Matter movement. She talks about the Justice for Palestine movement, and she sort of connects these struggles, whether it's the Black liberation struggle in America, the Palestinian struggle, and so on and so forth. So, for sure. Yeah. And so you can always check out her like interviews and stuff and speeches on YouTube or whatever.
And do. Actually, like, I definitely got to recommend it.
Absolutely.
But okay, I guess, what are we covering next time?
So next time is going to be a very special episode of Red Reviews. It's going to be the first episode where we have a guest. And I'm very, very excited. So the next time we're going to be doing this book here. It's called Revolutionary Education, Theory and Practice for Socialist Organizers. This is a book put out by the Party for Socialism and Liberation, which I am a member of. And so this book is about sort of the history and theory of Marxist pedagogy, like how we learn and how we can apply that to our organizing. And the editor of the book is Nino Brown, and Nino Brown also contributed a chapter in this book. Nino will be our guest for that episode. And we will spend, the hour or however much time we have with him discussing the book and its relevance, not just for the sort of Marxist-Leninist left, which I belong to, but the left in general. So that's going to be a really, really exciting one. And then after that, I think we're going to be doing some anarchist theory. I think we're going to be doing 2 Kropotkin books.
Very cool.
And I wanted to mention while I'm in the chat here, that the one person who commented on, are we going to do a book of Trotskyist theory? The answer is yes. We will be doing a book called The Permanent Revolution and Results and Prospects. We'll be doing that book later on in the year. But yes, we will be doing Trotskyist theory to kind of cover our bases. And I'm excited to kind of dip my toes into that.
Awesome. So I guess, where can people find you?
Great. So they can find all my work at justinclark.org. That is my website where I have all my professional work as well as the work I do on the side. My blog is there. I have a new article out in the Truth Seeker magazine about the humanist philosopher Paul Kurtz. You can also read that on my website. And I also wrote an essay on Christopher Lasch, which we talked about in a previous episode that's been published by Midwestern Marx. So you can check that stuff out too. You can also check me out on Instagram at Justin Clark PH. And now I'm also on TikTok. So you can find me on TikTok at Justin Clark PH. I figured I'd join in with the kids.
Yep. And
get on the TikTok and try to do a little bit more education and agitation there.
There's lots of good leftist content on TikTok.
Definitely. And maybe they don't need another person in that, but what the hell,
there's always room for more.
Great. So definitely check out that stuff. And also, if you're interested to learn more about my own particular political orientation, you can also check out the Party for Socialism and Liberation. We are a Marxist-Leninist party. That's an international party with branches in multiple cities in the country. And if you want to learn more about that, you just go to pslweb.org, or you can check out like Liberation News or Liberation School to kind of learn a little bit more about Marxist-Leninist theory and kind of where we're coming from.
Very cool. Well, thank you so much, Justin.
Thank you, Cory. This has been a whole lot of fun.
That's all, folks. Thanks for watching or listening. Remember to share this show with your friends or on the social media site that you use the most. Thank you to everyone who supports this show on Patreon. It's really appreciated and it helps me spend more time on this and my other projects. If you want to contribute, you can do that at patreon.com/skepticalleftist, or you can buy me a coffee at buymeacoffee.com/skepticallefty. If you can't contribute financially, then a 5-star rating and a review on the podcast app of your choice, or on one of the podcast review sites like Podchaser or ratemypodcast.com would be great. If you want to find more from me, make sure to check out the show notes or check out my Linktree. That's linktr.ee/skepticalcory. You can find all my social media stuff there, as well as links to my other show, From Many People's Strength, which is a podcast about Saskatchewan politics, and a project I'm involved in with my friend Damien Marie at Hope that's called Atheist, Humanist, Leftist, Revolutionaries. My Twitter is @skepticallefty, and my Facebook page is The Mind of a Skeptical Leftist. You can email me at mindofaskepticalleftist@gmail.com. And if you want to be a guest on the show or know someone I should reach out to, then feel free to let me know. You can book interviews in my available time slots on my Calendly, which is also found in my Linktree. Thanks so much for listening, and let's try to make sure we're applying critical thinking and reasoned skepticism when we're attacking the system. If we get caught up in bad thinking, we can derail ourselves.